In this lecture, we're going to finish up muscle histology and physiology. Now, as we mentioned before, there's going to be variation in skeletal muscle fibers. And again, depending on the amount of myoglobin, mitochondria, and capillaries, that's going to depend on basically how much oxygen, how much energy that particular muscle needs. If that muscle is a very active muscle, of course, it's going to need more ATP. It's going to need more oxygen. And we kind of made the comparison of chicken. Again, a chicken walks more than it flies, and so its legs and thigh muscles are going to have more blood vessels. It's going to have more myoglobin carrying the oxygen, so the meat is going to appear a bit darker. And that is going to be considered our red muscle fibers. There's going to be more myoglobin, and again, that's the oxygen storing reddish pigment. It's going to have more capillaries and more mitochondria. Its flight muscles, the breast muscles, are going to be white meat, and so that's going to be the white muscle fibers. There's going to be less myoglobin and fewer capillaries, and that's going to give the meat or the muscle fibers their pale color. Now, contraction and relaxation speeds are going to vary, and what that means is how fast the myosin ATPase hydrolyzes ATP. In other words, how fast can it snap that phosphate off of the ATP, turning it into ADP and also a phosphate molecule while releasing the energy. So in other words, how fast can it release energy from ATP? And then also resistance to fatigue. There's going to be different metabolic reactions used to generate ATP. Now here's classification of muscle fibers. We have what are called slow oxidative or slow twitch fibers. It's going to be red in color. There's going to be lots of mitochondria, myoglobin, and blood vessels. It's for prolonged, sustained contractions for things such as maintaining posture. There's going to be fast oxidative glycolytic fibers. These are going to be the fast twitch fibers as opposed to the slow oxidative, which are slow twitch fibers. So again, the fast oxidative glycolytic are fast twitch A fibers. It's going to be red in color. There's going to be lots of mitochondria, myoglobin, and blood vessels. And it's going to split ATP at a very fast rate. And it's going to be used for things such as walking and sprinting. And then our fast glycolytic or fast twitch B muscles, they're going to be white in color, few mitochondria and blood vessels, and relatively low myoglobin. And it's going to be used for anaerobic movements for short durations, such as weightlifting. Now, the fiber types within a whole muscle, now most muscles contain a mixture of all three fiber types. The proportions usually vary with the usual activity of the muscle. So neck, back, and leg muscles have a higher proportion of postural, slow oxidative fibers. Shoulder and arm muscles have a higher proportion of fast glycolytic muscles, so the faster twitch fibers. And all fibers of any one motor unit are going to be the same. Now, different fibers are going to be recruited as needed. Anabolic steroids. Now, it's going to be similar to testosterone. It's going to increase muscle size, strength, and endurance. However, there's many side effects which are very serious with abusing anabolic steroids. One of those things is liver cancer, kidney disease, heart disease, mood swings, facial hair and voice deepening in females, and atrophy of testicles and baldness in males. Now looking at the anatomy of cardiac muscle, if you remember, cardiac muscle is striated and involuntary. It's striated because of the sliding filaments are going to be very similar to skeletal muscle. So it's going to be striated, short quadrangular shaped branching fibers. It's going to have a centrally located nucleus. And the cells are connected by intercalated discs, which are going to have gap junctions. These gap junctions are going to allow the cells to communicate with one another. This helps the cells to coordinate its contraction so that they can beat in sync or synchronously. And as said before, it's going to have the same arrangement of thick and thin filaments as skeletal muscle, again, giving it that striated appearance. Let's look at cardiac versus skeletal muscle. In cardiac muscle, there's going to be more sarcoplasm and mitochondria. Cardiac muscle is also going to have larger transverse tubules located at the Z discs rather than at the A1 band junctions. It's going to have a less well-developed sarcoplasmic reticulum. And remember, the sarcoplasmic reticulum is what's going to hold calcium. So it's going to have limited intracellular calcium reserves. More of the calcium is going to enter the cell from the extracellular fluid during contraction. Now, prolonged delivery of calcium to the sarcoplasm produces a contraction that's going to last 10 to 15 times longer than in a skeletal muscle. Because remember, the heart never stops and takes a rest. Whereas skeletal muscles, if they're used constantly, are going to fatigue. The heart can't fatigue. It's constantly beating. So it's going to be utilizing calcium at a much greater rate. It's going to contract many more times than skeletal muscle will. And so the arrangement is going to be a little bit different as far as delivery and reception of the calcium. Now, the appearance of the cardiac muscle, it's, again, striated muscle. It's going to contain the thick and thin filaments, as we see here in the myofibril. The T tubules are located at the Z discs, as you can see right here. And it's going to have less sarcoplasmic reticulum, as we just mentioned. Now, the physiology of cardiac muscle, again, these are autorhythmic cells. They're going to contract without stimulation. You can take cardiac muscle cells, put them in a tissue culture, and the individual cells will contract on their own. When the cells are put together, they begin to contract in unison. Okay, and it can contract 75 times per minute, and it also needs a lot of oxygen. The larger mitochondria generate ATP aerobically, and sustained contraction is possible due to the slow calcium delivery. Calcium channels to the extracellular fluid are going to stay open. Now, looking at two types of smooth muscle, we're going to have visceral or single unit smooth muscle and multi-unit smooth muscle. Visceral single unit muscle is found in the walls of hollow viscera and small blood vessels. Hollow viscera would include the esophagus. It would include the intestines. So things like that. They're going to be autorhythmic. And it's going to have gap junctions that cause the fibers to contract in unison, just like what we talked about with the cardiac muscle. Now, the multi-unit is going to have individual fibers with their own motor neuron ending. It's going to be found in large arteries, large airways. Remember the erector pili muscle that's attached to hair? That's going to be a multi-unit type smooth muscle. The iris of the eye, in other words, that's what makes the pupil smaller and larger. And also the ciliary bodies found in the eye as well. And microscopically, this is what smooth muscle looks like. And again, some people can confuse this with dense regular connective tissue. It's just a matter of training the eye to tell the two apart. It's going to have small, involuntary muscle cells that taper on the ends. It's going to have a single oval centrally located nucleus. Now, it lacks T tubules and has little sarcoplasmic reticulum for calcium storage. Now, the thick and thin filaments are going to be arranged differently in smooth muscle than it is in cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle. And since it's going to be arranged differently, we're not going to get those striations or stripes that we would see under the microscope. Okay, so the thick and thin filaments are not orderly arranged, so it lacks sarcomeres. The sliding of the thick and thin filaments generates tension, which is transferred to intermediate filaments and dense bodies attached to the sarcolemma. So it kind of creates almost like a mesh around the cell. And when the muscle fibers contracts and twists into a helix as it shortens. And then it relaxes by untwisting. So again, those fibers, again, act as like a mesh surrounding that cell. When the fibers contract, it twists the cell, shortening it. When it relaxes, it untwists and elongates. Looking at the physiology of smooth muscle, contractions start slowly and last longer. No transverse tubules and very little sarcoplasmic reticulum, so the calcium must flow in from outside. Now, instead of troponin, remember troponin when we looked at how the skeletal muscle contracts, it's going to use something called calmodulin. So calcium binds to calmodulin, turning on an enzyme, and that enzyme is myosin light chain kinase, and that phosphorylates the myosin head so that the contraction can occur. And the enzyme is going to work slowly, slowing down contractions. Now, smooth muscle tone, calcium moves slowly out of the cell, it delays relaxation, providing for a state of continued partial contraction, and it's sustained for long term. Now, where this is useful is within blood vessels for maintaining blood pressure. Also, you'll see this in the intestines, where there's a steady pressure on the contents of the gastrointestinal tract. Often when food, or at least what the food is at that point in time, chyme, enters the intestine feeling that stretch will clamp down on the food stuff that's in the GI tract and then relax back out a little bit, maintaining that constant pressure. Regulation of contraction. Regulation of contraction is due to nerve signals from the autonomic nervous system and changes in local conditions such as pH, oxygen levels, carbon dioxide levels, temperature, and ionic concentrations. Also, hormones can regulate contraction, such as epinephrine, which relaxes muscles in the airways, and it relaxes some blood vessels. Now, I said some blood vessels will actually contract. And epinephrine will cause blood pressure to increase. But in some areas, blood vessels will relax. The stress relaxation response, when stretched, initially contracts and then tension decreases to what's needed, and that's what I described like in the intestines. So stretch hollow organs as they fill, and yet pressure remains fairly constant. When empty, the muscle rebounds and the walls firm up. Regeneration of muscle. Skeletal muscle fibers cannot divide after the first year. Growth is enlargement of existing cells. Okay, and again we call that hypertrophy. Repair, satellite cells and bone marrow produce some new cells. If not enough numbers, fibrosis often occurs. And then cardiac muscle cells cannot divide or regenerate. All healing is done by fibrosing or scar formation. And then smooth muscle fibers regeneration is possible. Remember, we're constantly making new blood vessels. If some blood vessels get damaged or capillaries get damaged, we make new ones. Okay? If a blood vessel is, for instance, cut like during a surgery, then new routes are formed. Sometimes if there's a blockage in a blood vessel, it might form another blood vessel to get to tissue. So what's one of the main components of blood vessels but smooth muscle? So it's going to have to regenerate. So cells can grow in size, and again, we call that hypertrophy. Some cells, such as uterine cells, can divide, and we call that hyperplasia. And then new fibers can form from stem cells in blood vessel walls. Aging in muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle starts to be replaced by fat beginning at the age of 30. In other words, use it or lose it. And my comment to that is, tell me about it. Slowing of reflexes and decrease in maximal strength happens as you age, and you get a change in fiber type to slow oxidative fibers, which may be due to lack of use or maybe just a result of aging. And so that concludes this lecture.